Daf Samach Beis Amud Aleph will begin Daf Samach Aleph Amud Beis, right at the end of the last line on the Amud. We learned previously a machlekes between Rav and Rav Chisda if a person shechs lemulim almanas she's kaper boy reilim. Is that kosher or not? We had one interpretation of the machlekes, but Rav Ashi rejected that, and he said that in fact he says that the chabura has to be completely made up of a reilim to be possible. When we say that the chabura is possible if it has a reilim, it says, therefore he says that ad ika kula arla loy pasla loy shna b'shchita loy shna b'zrika, whether it's shchita or with zrika, it's only possible if the entire chabura are a reilim. Therefore we don't use the word zois to distinguish between shchita and zrika. And the Ma'aser comes out, according to Rav Ashi, that not only if a person shechted for a reilim, it would be possible. If he did zrika for an entire chabura of a reilim, would also be possible. What therefore is the basis of the machlokes? What are they arguing about Rava and Rav Chisda? Elam Rav Ashi, he gives the following explanation. The Tosfos Rosh points out that Rabba himself, the Gemara quoted Rabba himself as saying the previous explanation. How can Rav Ashi argue on what Rabba himself said? Tosfos Rosh says that the Gemara attributed to Rabba, it said Rabba would have explained it this way, but in fact he himself didn't say it. So what is the machlekes now? So Ela Amar Rav Ashi says Rav Chisda v'Rabba b'Haikro Kamif. They're arguing about the following pasuk. It says, a person is nirtzah, let's accept him, the korban, to be mechaper for him. It has to be done for this person, for the baalim. And if there's a shinu baalim, if the avoid is done for somebody else who's not the baalim, it could possibly. So it has to be for this baalim and not for somebody else. Rabba says, where do we say that a shinui baalim passes? That's somebody that's chaver dumya didei, similar to him. Only somebody who could have kapara with this korban, if it's now intended, there's a shini from the baalim to him, does it possible? So therefore, mahu the bar kapara, chaver the bar kapara. The shina baalim is only if it's exchanged for a person who could have kapara with this kapara, with this korban rather. La puke hayoral la bar kapara, which therefore excludes the oral, which is not a bar kapara. An oral cannot eat the korban pesach. He's not part of this korban. He can't be yotze the mitzvah of the korban pesach. Therefore, Rabbah holds a shinu baalim, if there's an attempt to do the avodah for an oral. So somebody who's not part of this chabur, he's not part of the chabur, and he's an RL. So there's a shinoi baalim, there's an exchange for the baalim. He's not part of the chabura, but he's an RL. He could be part of the chabur anyway. So that's not called a shinoi baalim, and therefore it doesn't pass. Rav Chisda savar high oral nami. He says Rav Chisda says no. This oral also came in the bar chiyuvu because he's be'etzem, he's mechuyev. Now he can't eat it because he's an oral, but theoretically he could be part of this bar korban. Bar kapara, he's considered a bar kapara. Hoyalti boy misakin nashe. He can mal himself, so theoretically he could be part of this korban and mal himself, and therefore it's possible. It's a shinu baalim, and it passes. Therefore, that's the machlokes we're talking about. If the person did the avodah, he did the shchita for an orel who is not part of this chabura, is that called a shinui baalim and passes it or not? Rabbi says no. He says it's not called a shinui baalim because he's not bar kapor. Rabbi says theoretically he could be. The Meforshim have great difficulty with this pshat, because Rabbah holds that if he did the avodah for the oral, even if he did the zrika for the oral can't eat the korban, so it would passel. And we say it would passel it. So therefore, how can you say over here that even though he's not part of the chabura, it's not called a shinu baalim? Fine, it's not a shinu baalim, but he's shechting it, or he's doing the zrika for a person who is an oral. and an oral can't eat the korban. So how could this be? How could this Rabbah say that this is kosher? Granted, let's say that it's not considered Shinu Baalim, but he's still doing it. He's doing the avodah for an oral. Rabbi Kiva Eger asks another kasha. He says that, well, even if you don't consider it Shinu Baalim, but he's doing the avodah for someone as Shloi L'Menuyav, and Shloi L'Menuyav would passel it. So then, even if you don't consider it a Shinu Baalim, how can Rav possibly say it's kosher? So, Gemara continues, Mi Yisrael, Rav Chisda Hoyle Rabbah, Rav Chisda says that it should be considered to be that there is Bar Kapor, and it'll consider Shinu Baalim and passel it because of Hoyle. Does Rav Chisda hold of Hoyle? Of how Itmar we learn, if a person bakes on Yontav for the weekday. Now, there's baking on Yontav is mutter because l'sorach ha'echol nefesh, but that's only if you need it for the day. Now you're baking it for tomorrow. Rav Chisda Amar Leike, Rav Chisda says you're Leike, and Rav Amar ain't a Leike. Rav says you don't get midas. You're doing it for the next day. Rav Amar ain't a Leike, Amin Hoil V'imekloil Orchim Chazile. He says no, you're not Leike because theoretically it is suitable, it is usable for the Yontav, because guests might come. Even though you finish the meal, guests might come and you might have it for them. Rav Chisda Amar Loike Lo Yamrina and Hoyle. Rav Chisda says Loike because Lo Yamrina and Hoyle. So what do we see over here? We seem to see over here that it's a stira between Rabbah and Rav Chisda. That over here Rabbah says of Hoyle, and Rav Chisda says we don't know of Hoyle. And which seems to be just the opposite of what we're saying here in our Gemara. So Gemara says, Bishlama the Rabba like kasha. Bishlama Rabba the Rabba, it's not a kasha. Hacha mechusar maisa, hasam le mechusar maisa. Over there, Rabba says we say hoyel because over there, by baking from Yontav, he doesn't have to do a maisa. Meaning guests might come on their own, or he might invite them, but he doesn't have to do a maisa to bring the guests over here. So his food can be usable for Yontav without an extra action. There we say hoyel. It's not mechusar maisa. Hacha mechusar maisa, hasam loy mechusar maisa. Ela the Rav Chisda kasha, but Rav Chisda seems to be a kasha because madach over there where there's no maisa, it's not mechusar maisa. He doesn't say hoyel. Here where you need a maisa to do the mila, why should he say of hoyel? Our answer is Amri ki lesle the Rav Chisda hoyel. Where do we say the Rav Chisda does not hold of hoyel? That's the kula. So that's in the case of Yontav, or would be a kula. But lechumra islay. But lechumra, in the case of our case, it's lechumra. He holds it. He explains that midaraisa, you can't make such a chilik. Midaraisa, he does not hold of oil at all. But his machmir midarabonan, they passel it in our case lechumra. Brisa, we had the Brisa before, earlier on Daf Samach Aleph, that the Brisa said that we were comparing the case of Arelim to the case of Tumah. And we say that just like by Tumah, we say that by Tumah it's only if they're all Tomei, it only passes if they're all Tomei. Similarly, by the case of Arelim, it's also only if they're all Arelim, if entire Chabura are Arelim. So we say that we compare the two, that it has to be in the same category, that where they're all Arelim, we say Ma Tuma Lo Yasaba mixes Tuma Kechol Tuma, so Av Orla Lo Yasaba mixes Orla Kechol Tuma. So reflecting more, what does this mean? What does this Brisa mean? Omer Leimar Zut Reder Amor Loravina Katani Hoil Orla Paiselis Vitum Paiselis. Ma Tuma Lo Yasaba mixes Tum Kechol Tuma, Av Orla Lo Yasaba mixes Orla Kechol Orla. So Hi Tuma Hechidai. What is the case of the Tuma over here? If we're talking about where the person is Tomei, that the people in the Chabura are Tomei, and my loy asaba mixes tum kechol tuma, that means the ika arba v'chamisha gavet meim. For instance, if you have 4 or 5 people who are tomei, v'arba v'chamisha gavet taharim, and 4 or 5 people who are taharim, loy paslu tameim l'taharim. The ones who are tomei don't paslu taharim because it's only possible if the entire chabura tameim. So, and therefore we want to learn out from that to Orla, to the case of Arelim, Gabe Arla Nami Haloi Pasle, because by Orla it also doesn't pass. It's not the Mulav Kosher. So, Maishna Tuma, the Pshitale, Maishna Orla, the Masafkale. Well, why do we have a suffix by Orla, and why is it pashed by Tuma? And why would we say, and therefore it's so pashut by like Tumah, it has to be the entire Chabura, and by Arelim that we would have to learn out from there. Why is Tumah more pashut? Why would this halacha that they all have to be Tmeim more pashut by Tumah than by Orla and by Arelim that they all have to be Arelim? Ella, we must say, but Tumah's Basar, what we're talking about is not that the people are Tumah. We're talking about the meat. The meat is Tumah. What does it mean that it didn't make partial tumah like total tumah? It means if one of the vorm of the Korban Pesach Tomei hided Mesarfinale, that limb that is Tomei, we burn it. So there was a limb that became Tomei, that was severed, and it became Tomei, and so we burn it, and it doesn't affect the rest. It doesn't affect the rest of the meat. So that's what we must be referring to. Just like over there, we don't say mixes tumah as kachol tumah. By arelim also, they have to be all arelim. Well, therefore, you're telling me the case by tumas balsar. Ema seifa donim davar sheina noig b'chol hazvachim midavar sheina noig b'chol hazvachim. V'al yochiach zman shenaig b'chol hazvachim. Now before we learned it in the Brisa, so perhaps we should now done it from Pigul, from Zman, and over there we don't say that it has to be a Machshavas Pigul for the entire Korban. We say even part of the Korban makes it Pigul. So what are we referring to over there? We're saying that we say we should done something, that Arelim, this is a particular din by Korban Pesach, it doesn't apply to other Korbanos, it doesn't passel the other Korbanos, it's by a specific Korban, by Korban Pesach. So rather learn out from that, and from Tumah, which also is not something that's noeg b'chol hazvachim, because a person can send his korban, if he's tummy, he can send the korban. And therefore, don't learn out from pigul, which is a psul, which applies from all the korbanos. Now, you're telling me that the tumah that we're talking about is tumas basar. What do you mean it's not noeg b'chol hazvachim? All korbanos who are tummy, I cannot be eaten. It's noeg in all the korbanos. So in this component, in this section of the Brisa, we must be talking, when we talk about Tumah, we must be talking about Tumah's Gavre, the person is Tumah. And what does it mean that it's not Noig the Korbanot B'chol Hazvachim, Dila B'chol Hazvachim, Oral V'Tomim, Shalch B'Korban Esayim? Because by other Korbanos, someone is Oral V'Tomim can send in the Korban, even though he's Tomei, he can't eat it, but he can send it in and it still be valid for him. But in the case of Korban Pesach, they can't. So Reisha b'tumas balsa v'seiva b'tumas gavra. Are you going to tell me that the Reisha is talking where the meat became tumah, and the seiva is talking where the person became tumah? He said, yeah, shame tumah kapara. Even though there are different particular situations of tumah, but it's one category of tumah. It's shame tumah. It's asking from the shame, the cloliest shame of tumah. Perhaps I'll tell you Seifa Nami, but Tumas Basar. Then they can tell me that the Seifa is by Tumas Basar, not Tumas Gavra. And what does it mean that it's not Naig in another Korbanos? Any Korban that became Tomei is possible. What it means is whether by other Korbanos, if the Chelev, the Morim, the chil that's burnt on the mizbeach became tamei, and the basar's kaim, the meat is intact. It's not tamei. Bench it my basar, or the basar is tamei. The chil kaim, zarikas adam. The kaim can still do the zarikas adam. He can do the avoida. He can still do the avoida. But Ve'ilu bepesach, by Korban Pesach, nitma chelev v'basar kayim, if the chelev became tomei. The basar is not tomei, it's kayim, then yes, the reg is adam. But nitma basar v'chelev kayim, but if the basar became tomei, and even though the chelev is not, ain't a zarek is adam, because the Korban Pesach has to be, the avoid is to eat it, it has to be eaten. So therefore, this tumah does not apply. This case of tumah does not apply to all korbanos. Well, the end of that brisa says, we talk about something where there's no exception, and we learn out from something where there's no exception. It is not yotzim reklal. So therefore, rather learn out from arelim to something which is pigul, which there's no exception. But by tuma, there's hutar miklola. So what is the exception by tuma? B'mai. Ilema, if you're going to say it's betumas basar, that it's talking about the meat became toma, where's the exception? Elab shita betumas gavra. It must be referring to where the person became toma, the tumas gavra. And where is their exception? B'tzibur, where the tzibur became tomei, and tuma hutra b'tzibur, if it became, the tzibur became tomei, then we can, nevertheless, we can offer the korban for the tzibur that became tomei. So if a yochid became tomei, then you can't be mishalei korban. So if he's tomei, you can't do the korban pesach. But if it's a tzibur, you can. So therefore, we see that it's talking about gavrin. It's talking about not the meat, it's talking about the person. So Reisha b'tumas balsa v'seifa b'tumas gavra. Again, the same question you're going to say. The Reisha is talking about the tumah of the balsa and the seifa where the person becomes tomei. Where it says in shem tumah kapar. So we said before, it's one category of tumah. V'iba yisema. Rather, I could tell you that kula b'tumas balsa. That we're talking kula b'tumas balsa. And this latter case is also talking about tumas basar. Where's the exception? Where do we see that tumas basar is hutra? But tumas pesach in a case where the pesach is bal betuma, when the tzibur is tomei. So there they bring the korban pesach. This non pesach bal betuma, the pesach that comes betuma, nechal betuma, can even be eaten betuma. Now, even though generally speaking, we say that a person who's tomei can be mishaleach korban, but he can't eat it. But over here, this case whereby the pesach that's bal betuma, it can even be eaten betuma. Now, if he eats it betuma, that means that the basar became tomei. So here you have a case where the meat of the korban becomes tomei, and yet it can be eaten, which is an exception. So over here, the korban pesach has to be brought to be eaten. If we allow you to eat the korban pesach, it's hutra b'tzibur, but therefore we must al korcha say that you were allowed to eat it. If you're eating it, you're being matamid. So you see a case where there's an exception that by the tumas basar, it's nachal b'tumah.